I want you to picture something for me. You're 71 years old, sitting in your son's living room in Michigan, and he's showing you brochures, glossy pamphlets for assisted living communities, places with names like Golden Meadows and Sunrise Senior Village, beautiful photographs of smiling elderly people, playing cards, painting watercolors, rocking on wraparound porches. He's trying to be gentle about it. He's saying things like, "Mom, we just want you to be safe." And you'd have people around all the time, and apparently the food is actually really good. But what you're hearing is something else entirely. What you're hearing is, "We think your life is basically over." I'm Catherine. I'm 71 years old, and 2 years ago, my 3 children sat me down for what they called a family conversation about my future. What they really meant was, they wanted to move me into a home, a nice one. They'd already done the legwork. They had spreadsheets comparing prices. My oldest daughter, Amy, had toured 4 different facilities within 50 miles of her place in Ann Arbor. My son, Marcus, had looked into the credentials of the medical staff. My youngest, Jennifer, had worked out how often each of them could realistically visit. They had every detail figured out, every detail except one. Not one of them had thought to ask me what I actually wanted. So, let me tell you what I did instead. I sold my house in Grand Rapids. I gave away most of the furniture. I packed 2 suitcases and bought a one-way ticket to Manila. I moved to the Philippines alone at 71 years old, while my children were convinced I'd lost my mind. And I'll tell you now, it's the best decision I've made in 30 years. Maybe ever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how I ended up in that living room staring at brochures for places I never had any intention of living in. My husband Richard died 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer. It moved fast. From the diagnosis to the end was only 7 months. We'd been married 46 years. We raised 3 children together. We built a whole life in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Richard spent 33 years at an automotive parts supplier. I taught 3rd grade. We had a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. We had grandchildren. We had our routines. And then he was gone. And none of that felt like mine anymore. Not really. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of things that reminded me of him without bringing him back. My children began calling more, checking in constantly. At first, it felt like love. Before long, it started to feel like surveillance. Amy would call every Tuesday evening. Marcus would text every Thursday. Jennifer would video call on Sundays. Always the same questions. "How's your eating, Mom? Are you getting out of the house? Have you seen the doctor lately? Are you taking your blood pressure pills?" I understood where it came from. They'd just lost their father, and they were terrified of losing me too. But understanding a thing doesn't always make it easier to sit with. About 6 months after Richard died, I started to feel something I couldn't quite put a name to. It wasn't depression, exactly. I'd already sat with a grief counselor. I knew what that felt like. This was different. More like a slow, quiet realization that the life I'd been living for decades wasn't really mine anymore. It had belonged to both of us, Richard and me, now that he was gone. I was just moving through the motions of a life that no longer fit. I'd wake at 6:30 every morning because that's when I'd always woken. I'd make coffee in the same machine we'd owned for 12 years. I'd sit in the same chair at the kitchen table. I'd read the Grand Rapids Press even though most days I couldn't have told you a single thing I'd read. Then I'd go looking for something to do, tighten a loose hinge, reorganize the garage for the 4th time, drive to the grocery store, and wander the aisles buying things I didn't need. My neighbor Diane, a woman about my age I'd known for 20 years, asked me one Saturday if I wanted to get lunch. We went to a diner we'd been to 100 times. We ordered the same sandwiches we always ordered. Halfway through the meal, she looked at me and said, "You doing all right, Catherine? You seem like you're somewhere else." I told her I was fine, but that night, sitting alone in my living room, I asked myself a question I hadn't let myself ask in a long time. If I could do anything, go anywhere, live any life at all, what would I choose? And the answer that came surprised me. I'd leave. Now, I need to be clear about something. I didn't wake up one morning and simply decide to move to the Philippines. This wasn't some impulsive decision born out of grief. It took months, and it started in the strangest way. I was at the VA office in Grand Rapids, finishing up paperwork for Richard's survivor benefits. While I waited, I fell into conversation with another woman in the waiting area, a Filipino-American named Elena, maybe 65 or 66. Her family had immigrated when she was a girl. We talked about the usual things, the weather, the wait times, how bad the roads got in a Michigan winter. Then she mentioned she'd just returned from 3 weeks in the Philippines visiting relatives. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos. Beaches, open-air markets, a family gathering at her cousin's house with what looked like 50 people crowded around tables, piled high with food. She told me her late husband's pension and her Social Security would stretch 3 times as far there, that the weather stayed warm all year, that her relatives treated her like royalty every time she visited. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I got curious. I started reading. Nothing serious at first, just browsing. I looked up the cost of living in the Philippines. I read expat blogs. I watched YouTube videos of retired Americans settled in Manila, Cebu, Davao. I learned about the Special Resident Retirees Visa, the SRV, which lets foreign retirees live there long-term if they meet certain conditions. And the more I read, the more something shifted inside me. Not excitement exactly. More like possibility, like a door I hadn't known existed, had cracked open. I kept it to myself for a while, didn't tell my children, didn't tell my friends. I just kept reading. I joined Facebook groups for expats in the Philippines and started asking questions. What's the healthcare like? Is it safe? How hard is it to find a place to live? What do you miss most about home? What do you love most about being there? The answers were all over the map. Some people said it was the best decision of their lives. Others had moved back after a year. But the ones who'd stayed 5, 10, 15 years, they all said the same thing. It's not perfect, but it beats being lonely in a country where everything costs twice as much and nobody has time to sit and talk with you. That landed harder than I expected. After about 4 months of reading, I made a decision. I would take a trip. Just a trip. 2 weeks. I'd see Manila and Cebu, maybe Dumaguete. See it with my own eyes. If I hated it, I'd come home, and that would be the end of the matter. I told my children I was taking a vacation. When Amy asked where, I said Southeast Asia. She was worried immediately. "Mom, is that safe at your age?" I told her I'd be fine, that I'd traveled plenty in my life, that I was a grown woman. She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. I flew out of Detroit in February. Michigan in February is gray, cold, and miserable. 14 hours later, I landed in Manila and stepped out of the airport into air so warm and thick, it felt like walking into a blanket. It was chaos, traffic everywhere, jeepneys packed with riders, motorbikes weaving between cars, vendors selling roasted peanuts and phone chargers along the roadside. Loud, overwhelming, completely alive. I loved it instantly. I spent 4 days in Manila, staying in a modest hotel in Makati. I walked everywhere. I ate in local restaurants. I rode the LRT. I visited Rizal Park. I sat in coffee shops and watched the city move around me. For the first time in maybe 2 years, I didn't feel invisible. People talked to me. The woman at the convenience store asked where I was from and told me her cousin lived in Chicago. The jeepney driver helped me find my route and wouldn't let me overpay. A man at a restaurant struck up a conversation simply because I was sitting alone and he thought I might want the company. It wasn't pity, it was just plain friendliness. The kind I'd forgotten still existed. From Manila, I flew to Cebu, and that's where everything changed. Cebu City is smaller than Manila, but still a major city, over 1 million people, with malls, hospitals, universities, an international airport. But it also had something Manila hadn't quite given me. It felt manageable. I could picture myself living there. I stayed in an Airbnb in a neighborhood called Lahug, a small one-bedroom on the 4th floor of a mid-rise building with a balcony overlooking the city. Rent was 22,000 pesos a month, about $400. Furnished, with Wi-Fi in a safe neighborhood. I sat on that balcony my first night with a San Miguel I'd bought at the 7-Eleven downstairs for less than $1, and I thought I could do this. Not just visit, live. I spent the following week exploring. I went to Ayala Center Cebu, one of the big malls, grocery stores, pharmacies, clinics, a movie theater, restaurants, everything under one roof. I toured Chunghwa Hospital, one of the largest private hospitals in the region. Clean, modern, English-speaking staff. I asked about costs. A general checkup ran around 1,500 pesos, about $27. Even with Medicare back home, I'd have paid more. I talked to expats. I met a woman named Georgia from California who'd been in Cebu 8 years. She was 74. She told me she'd moved after her husband passed, same as me. The first few months were rough, she said. But once she found her rhythm, she couldn't imagine going back. She introduced me to her neighbors, her friends, the woman who cleaned her apartment twice a week. She took me to her favorite restaurant for lechon, roasted pig. So good, I went back 3 times in a single week. By the end of those 2 weeks, I knew. I flew home to Michigan and didn't say a word right away. I sat with it for a few days. I made lists, pros and cons, what I'd be giving up, what I stood to gain. I thought about my children. I thought about my grandchildren. I thought about my house, my routines, my life in Grand Rapids. And then I thought about that balcony in Lahug, the warm air, the city lights, the beer that cost less than $1, people who smiled at me not because they had to, but because that's simply who they were. 3 weeks after I got home, I called a realtor and put the house on the market. That's when everything came apart. Amy found out first. She'd come by to help me with something, I don't even remember what, and spotted the realtor's sign in the yard. She didn't raise her voice. Amy never raises her voice. She just went very still and very quiet, then asked, "Mom, what's going on?" I told her I was moving to the Philippines. She looked at me like I'd announced I was joining the circus. She called Marcus and Jennifer, and 2 days later, all 3 of them were sitting in my living room. That's when the brochures came out. Amy did most of the talking. She'd clearly prepared printouts, articles, a list of concerns. "Mom, you're 71. You don't speak Tagalog. You don't know anyone there. What if you get sick? What if you fall? What if something happens and we can't reach you?" Marcus jumped in. "Do you understand how far away that is? It's a 15-hour flight minimum. If there's an emergency, we can't just drive over." Jennifer, always the most direct, just looked at me and said, "Mom, this is insane. You can't move to a country you visited once for 2 weeks." I let them talk. I didn't interrupt. When they'd finished, I said, "I understand why you're worried, but I'm going." Amy's voice cracked. "We're not trying to control you. We're trying to keep you safe." I know that's what they believed, but safety isn't the same thing as living. I'd spent 2 years being safe. Safe in my house in Grand Rapids, safe going to the same grocery store, the same diner, the same VA office, safe and small and so terribly lonely. I didn't say any of that out loud. I don't think they were ready to hear it. Instead, I told them I'd done the research.